forcing us and helping us to bring others to you. This is what I pray in Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior's holy name. Amen. Okay, so with that, here's our second. Good morning, guys. Are you going to do the intro? I'm sorry.
Yeah, let me start, then you can go ahead and finish this up.
The pencil. You have a pencil?
Okay, so as developing this class, I mean, when we first talked about last week, it was kind of a work in progress. I think we've kind of figured out how we want the class to go. So I'm going to give you a preview of a little bit today and then what's ahead for us. So for today, what we're going to do is we're going to break down the teaching of the Old Testament. We're going to kind of get down in the weeds a little bit on a couple of things. The timelines, the characters, and the books of the Bible. You guys are going to start being able to place where people are within the Bible. You want us to give out the timeline? Yep. Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you guys a blank timeline sheet so that you can start filling in all these big events that happen in the Bible and where the books actually lie and where these characters are. So eventually what will happen is you'll start being able to piece together the sequential order of the Old Testament. Now there's a lot of information in the Old Testament. Basically, what we're going through, so you guys understand, there's a 4,000-year period between Adam and the cross. Okay? So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover approximately 2,000 years of time in the characters and the books of the Bible. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you, have you given them out yet? Where are those timelines?
That's what I'm trying to find. I'll give it.
I hope you guys can see the TV while I'm at.
Did you grab it on the stand?
This timeline.
No. If there's some stuff on the copier, let me go look.
No, I brought it.
You got it?
No, I brought it.
Oh, you got it.
Here they are. I got it.
Okay. So what we're going to do is, like I said, we're going to start filling in some of these things on the timeline. We're going to give you a blank copy of them so you guys can start writing your notes. So today, basically, we're going to go through two main books of the Old Testament. And again, it's not exhaustive, right? But we want to give you guys enough information so that you get the big picture. For instance, if Dave's trying to explain to me his line of business, he works on elevators. Don't start with telling me how the engines work and the inner workings. I want to know the overall picture. It's a box, there's a cable, people get in. I want to hear that. So what we're going to try to teach you today is the bigger picture. And what we hope that you guys do are inspired to actually go in and read Genesis and read Exodus, the two books that we're going to go over today. And now that you've understood the big picture, when you start to read it, right, things will be a little bit familiar. Now, one of the things that I've done in part of my journey of discovering the Old Testament, the New Testament I got, that's pretty not basic, but to me it was very easy to learn. The Old Testament was a whole other ball of wax. It's a lot of information. What I did as a crutch is I went to a place called the Bible Project. And if I was going to read a book of the Bible, what I like to do is I like to go to the Bible Project and watch their quick explanation of the book so that I had an idea of what they're talking about, how this thing is broken down, so that when I go and sit there and read it, it kind of makes sense. If you don't know what you're getting into, what it all means, the bigger picture, it's kind of hard to pick out the details. So what we wanted to do is kind of replicate that with you today. So what we're going to do is, and plus, there is a lot of information. Unlike Pastor Bernie, Dave and I can't do this extemporaneously. We just can't do it off the top of our head. It's a lot of information. We will make sure that you guys understand it and it's all gone over. So what we're going to do today is we're going to watch some videos. We're going to watch Genesis Part 1. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion. We're going to watch Genesis Part 2. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion. And then we're going to move on to Exodus. video 1 and video 2. And again, it's a visual breakdown of what the books are about. And by the end of today, we're going to get to right about here, about halfway point of the Old Testament. So here's how it's going to proceed further. Today we'll get through half the Old Testament. Next week we're going to do the second half and get up to the end of the Old Testament, that 400-year period of silence. And then week 4 we're going to do the New Testament. Week 4 and week 5 we're going to break that down just like we did with the Old Testament. Then week 7 we're going to talk about Jesus and the lessons that he basically taught. You're going to learn about the New Testament, you're going to learn about the disciples and the whole breakdown. Week 7 we're going to focus on what Jesus said to you and what he said to me. And then that's going to culminate in week 8, which we're going to talk about, now that you're born again, getting saved, congratulations. What did Jesus tell you to do? So that's where this whole thing is leading. And all the stuff that you're going to hear in the Old Testament, you're going to find out. All this points to the cross this way, and then when we get to the New Testament, it points back to the cross. So, having said that, Dave, did you want to?
Okay, so welcome again to everyone here. So that's kind of a quick lowdown of what we're going to be doing. So without further ado, why don't we just go ahead and start? We're going to do this kind of does each book. And it's very well done. It's a visual, hearing, visual type thing. You can make notes if you want, but let's start this thing. Pretty neat. Can everyone see the
The first book in the Bible is a book you've probably heard of. It's called
Can everyone see it?
Genesis.
Genesis comes from a Hebrew word. It's pronounced reshit, and it just means beginning.
Now, there's a lot of stories from the book of Genesis, and it's easy just to pull out a specific story and try to tell you what it might mean. But we think the best way to understand this book is to look at the book as a whole and show you how the whole thing is designed.
The book is designed to fall into 2 main parts. You have chapters 1 through 11, which is telling the story of God and the whole world. And then you have the second part, which is about God and Abraham's family. That's chapters 12 through 50. And how the 2 of those parts relate, that's where you find the message of the book.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning. The first part of Genesis begins with a creation story where God creates everything.
And how exactly that happens, of course, that's where all the debates come. But he takes a dark, watery chaos and he turns it into a beautiful garden where humans can flourish.
That sounds nuts.
It does sound nice. In fact, 7 different times God says of all that he's made that it's good.
And this is where we meet the first human characters in the Bible, Adam and Eve.
They're both individual characters, but they're also representative. Adam is the Hebrew word for humanity, and Eve is the Hebrew word for life. And God creates them in his image. In other words, humanity reflects, or is meant to reflect, the creativity, the goodness, and character of the Creator out into the world that he's made. And they're supposed to reproduce and make cultures and neighborhoods and art and gardens and everything else. But he gives them a moral choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And this is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about.
And he tells them, don't eat of the fruit of this tree or you will die. What's that all about?
So up till now, God has been the one defining and providing what is good. And so God is the one with the knowledge of good and evil. But now this tree represents a choice. Will the humans trust God's definition of good and evil? Or are they going to seize the opportunity and define good and evil for themselves?
And Adam and Eve eat the fruit.
This is the core biblical explanation for that concept of sin, that desire to call the shots myself. It's the inward turn of the human heart to do what's good for me and my tribe, even if it's at the expense of you and your tribe.
And the problem is humans are horrible at defining good and evil without God. And so now that humanity's made this choice, things get really
bad. So Genesis 3 through 11 is like tracing this downward spiral of all humanity. So Adam and Eve, they can't trust each other. anymore. And so there's a little story about how they were naked and felt fine about it beforehand, but now they feel shameful because all of a sudden Adam's definition of good and evil might be different than Eve's, and so they hide from each other.
Then there's another story of temptation. Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, and he gives in and kills him.
There's a story right after Cain about a guy named Lamech, and all we know about Lamech is that he accumulates wives like property, and he sings songs about how he's a more violent, vengeful person than Cain ever was, and he's proud of it.
Things get so bad with the human race that we see God decide to just wipe us out.
Yeah, we typically think of the flood story as about God being angry, but it actually begins with God's sadness and grief about the state of his world. And so out of his passion to preserve the goodness of his world, he washes it clean with the flood.
But there's a glimmer of hope. He chooses Noah and his whole family, and he saves them on this boat.
Yeah, don't forget about the animals.
Right, and the animals. So Noah and his family are going to reboot all of humanity. I mean, he must be a pretty great guy.
But this is the story most people don't know because it's kind of weird, is that Noah gets off the boat and he plants a vineyard and he gets totally plastered. And then something sketchy happens in his tent with his son. It's a tragic story.
So from here, humanity grows again, but things are as bad as before. And the last story is the famous story of the Tower of Babel.
And in this story, you have all of the nations uniting together to use this new technology they have, the brick. And they want to make a name for themselves and build this big city with a huge tower that will reach up to the gods. But God knows that this city will be a nightmare. And so in his mercy, he scatters them. And all of these stories, they're underlining the same basic idea. When humans seize autonomy from God, when they define good and evil for themselves, it results in a world of tragedy and death.
And this leaves you wondering, is there any hope for humanity?
Yes, yeah, there is. It's the very next story that answers that question. It's the beginning of God's mission to rescue and restore his world.
Should we go to the other video now?
Yeah,
The
this,
original one? Go ahead and tell them.
okay, this is part one. This is not the actual video that we were,
But it's good.
it goes through the same thing, and the same people. But it will do second. If you go to the project, it'll give you one in order.
Yeah. This one does show the Adam story a little bit more detailed than the other one.
Yeah, but it was cool. I mean, what'd you think? It kind of went through it all. Okay, so at this point, where are we? Been about Adam, right? Eve, then they messed up. So, sin, you know. So then we go to, it went to Noah, real quick. What's in Noah? Yeah, the flood. What's that?
Mind divides into two main parts.
This is the.
See, Adam and Eve, but also after Adam and Eve, you have what?
Cain and Abel.
Cain. Okay, so you have Cain and Abel at that point. Then we go to Noah. We start again, here's the flood, right? So wipes out, God wants to start again. So we do it again. So now we can start with Noah and his offspring, Ham, and Shem, and Japheth.
You want to break here and get back to the video?
Yeah, okay, so just trying to show you, we can start filling out our timeline.
This first video shows you a little bit more about the very beginning creation story. This is the one we want to show you that really breaks the book of Genesis down into two big main topics. This bypasses the whole creation part, I think. So let's watch this real quick.
The book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness, and makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now the irony of this is tragic, because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now right here the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed, or a descendant, will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head. Which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost, because the snake too will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the humans' decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, is going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11, they trace the widening ripple effect of the rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain's so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. And God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. So Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. And this is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He's the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He's accumulating them like property. And then he goes on to sing a short song about how he's more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claimed that they descended from the gods. And like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is right, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we're told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they're ruining each other. And so out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with a great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah, and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first. And the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. These stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we've all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict and violence and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
Yeah, that was the one that we wanted to play the first time. Yeah, I think this goes in a little bit more detail. Anyway, so out of this, what do we get? Most importantly, who is the wounded warrior that's going to be coming back?
Jesus.
Right. Exactly. And as you notice, we're here, and we're only halfway through Genesis. You know, we got to get all the way over here somewhere to get out of Genesis. It's a lot of stories, a lot of prophecy. It's just a neat book. It's more than just.
Are we going to hear more about Nimrod in part 2?
We're going to hear a little bit more about that. The important part to realize about Nimrod and how this story breaks away. Nimrod, really, in the Tower of Babel, what happens is two things happen. One, all these other societies, I don't even know if I'm spelling that right, China, Iran, all over the world, all these different people are spread throughout the world. And then the state of Israel goes the line of Abraham. We're going to talk about that. So this doesn't really get too into it, but just so that you know, that's how all these other races and these civilizations were created at the Tower of Babel. That's why God gave everybody different languages. So when you think about it, when somebody says, oh, the Quran or Islam is the truth, I don't think so, because all that stuff happened way down the line, 600 years before Christ, not 2,500 years or so. So two separate things. All these other civilizations and then Israel. So I think that's the important thing to gain, and you'll see a little bit of that in the next video.
Yeah, Tower, like Tim was saying, Tower of Babel, allowing people to be together. We can be as God. We can build buildings to God. And God was like, well, I'm going to have none of this. And he scattered everyone all into the earth.
Ready?
Okay, so
All right.
now,
Part 2.
Part 2.
The book of Genesis. In the first video, we saw how chapters 1 through 11 set up the basic storyline of the Bible. God has created all things, and he makes humans in his image to rule the world on his behalf. The humans choose sin and rebellion, and so the world spins out of control into violence and death, all leading up to the rebellion and scattering of the people in Babylon. And so the big question is, what is God going to do to rescue and redeem his world? Well, out of that scattering of Babylon, the author traces a genealogy of just one family that leads eventually to a man named Abram, later known as Abraham. And God's promise to Abraham at the beginning of chapter 12 opens up a whole new movement in the story. God calls Abraham to leave his home and go to the land of Canaan, which God says will become his one day. And in that land, God promises to make Abraham into a great nation, to make his name great, and to bless him. Now, these promises are connected back to earlier parts of the book. So Babylon had arrogantly tried to make a great name for itself, and that didn't go over very well. But God, in his generosity, is going to bestow a great name on this no-name guy, Abraham. And God's blessing of Abraham echoes all the way back to that original blessing God gave humanity in the beginning. So the question is, why is God going to bless Abraham and his family? And the last line of God's promise makes this clear. So that all the families of the earth will find God's blessing in you. Now this is key for understanding the whole rest of the biblical story. God's plan is to rescue and to bless his rebellious world through Abraham's family. And this is why the whole rest of the Old Testament story is just going to focus on this one family, eventually called the people of Israel. This is also why Israel will later be called a kingdom of priests at Mount Sinai. God wants to use them to show all of the other nations what he's like. And ultimately, this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets and poets who say that its fulfillment will come through Israel's messianic king, whose reign will bring justice and peace to all of the nations. Now, at this point of the story, none of that's clear. You just have to keep reading and watch the promise develop. And so the rest of the book focuses on Abraham and his family. First, Abraham himself, then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons. And the stories about each generation, they're united by two main themes. So first, each generation of Abraham's family is marked by repeated failure. They just keep making really bad decisions that mess up their lives and put God's promise in jeopardy. However, God remains faithful to them. He keeps rescuing them from themselves and reaffirming his commitment to bless them and bless the nations through them despite their failings. So the Abraham stories. God had promised Abraham a huge family, but on two different occasions, he's afraid for his life because other men are attracted to his wife, and so he denies that he's even married to her, which creates, of course, all of these problems. And not only that, Abraham and his wife Sarah, they can't have children, and so Sarah arranges for Abraham to sleep with one of their servant girls, which also creates all of these problems in the family. But each time, God bails Abraham out. And in chapters 15 and 17, God even formalizes his promise to Abraham with an official commitment called a covenant. This is a classic scene. God invites Abraham to look up at the night stars and to count them. And he says, that's how numerous your family is going to be. And despite all of the odds, having no kids and no way to have any at the moment, Abraham looks up in the sky and simply trusts God's promise. And God responds by entering into a covenant with Abraham, promising that he will become a father of many nations, that God's blessing may come to the whole world. God asks Abraham to mark his family with a sign of the covenant, circumcision of all the male boys in the family. This is a symbol to remind them that the fruitfulness of their family is a gift from God. And so Abraham has lots of kids eventually, and he dies at a good old age. Now the Jacob stories play out these themes even more dramatically. From birth, Jacob lives up to the meaning of his name, which is deceiver. He cheats his brother Esau out of his inheritance and blessing, and he does it by deceiving his old blind father, no less, and then he just takes off. He goes on to take 4 wives, even though he really only loves one, Rachel, and this creates all of these rivalries in the family. The only thing that humbles Jacob is being deceived by his uncle Laban, who cheats him out of years of his life. The tables have finally turned. And so it's a humbled Jacob that returns to his homeland. And in a very strange story, Jacob ends up wrestling with God as he demands that God bless him.
Some things never really change, do they? However, God honors his determination, and he passes Abraham's blessing on to him. And he renames Jacob as Israel, which means wrestles with God. Now, it's this last part of the book, the story of Jacob's sons, where all the themes come to a head. Jacob loves his second to youngest son, Joseph, more than any of the others, and he gives him this special jacket. And the 10 older sons come to hate Joseph, and so they kidnap him, and they plan to kill him, but instead they decide to just sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about family failure. But God is with Joseph, and he orchestrates Joseph's release from prison, and Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to second in command over all of Egypt. And so Joseph saves the nation of Egypt during a famine. And he also ends up saving his brothers and his family from starving to death. And so once again, we can see the folly and the sin of Abraham's family is met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of the brothers into an occasion to save life. And this is actually what Joseph says right near the end of the book. He says to his brothers, "You all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save many lives." Now, these words are strategically placed at the end of the book because they summarize not only the story of Joseph and his brothers, but the book as a whole. From Genesis 3 onward, humans keep acting selfishly and doing evil, but this God is not going to leave his world to its own devices. He remains faithful and determined to bless people despite their failures. You can see this especially in how that mysterious promise about the descendant of the woman gets developed throughout the book. So remember, Genesis 3, God promised that this wounded victor would come and crush the snake and defeat evil at its source. And the author then connects this promise directly to the line of Abraham. This is a part of how God's going to bring his blessing to the nations. Now from Abraham, this promise gets connected to Judah, the fourth son of Jacob. And this is how. In an extremely important poem in chapter 49, in aging Jacob, he's on his deathbed, he wants to bless his 12 sons. And when he comes to Judah, Jacob predicts that Judah will become the tribe of Israel's royal leaders, and that one day a king will come who will command the obedience of all the nations and fulfill God's promise to restore the garden blessing to all of the world. And then after this, Jacob dies. And later, Joseph dies too. And the growing family remains in Egypt. And so the book of Genesis ends with all of these future hopes and promises left hanging and undeveloped. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it's all going to turn out. But for now, that's the book of Genesis.
What do you think of those videos? I think they're pretty good, actually. You know, they kind of get your attention, and the writing and the hearing, and I think they're pretty good. That's why I figured what he goes through and how he says it, to do it faster than we can do it. So that's why we know. Let's try to bring these in, and they work pretty well. Okay, so what do we know? Okay, so we got the Nimrod, Tower of Babel. So then we get to Abraham, second part. Now, we're going to pass these out here to kind of go over each book, kind of the main characters. It's pretty well. Do we have enough?
Yeah, I think we should, if we don't, we'll have to make a couple more copies.
Okay.
We'll see when it gets down to here.
Start on this end, so that comes down. You got any extra over there? No?
What's that? We need a couple.
Okay.
Yeah.
We finished.
So we need one for
Gallagher?
Gallagher. Okay.
There has one. Go ahead. You got them?
Yes, so real quick point here. I mean, there's a lot in Genesis, obviously, and I thought, like Dave said, I think that really gives you a good overview. So think about it now, if you go back and sit down and read the book of Genesis, it's a little bit familiar to you, you kind of understand the big picture, so when you read this, you can kind of bring it all together. But you didn't hear everything here. I will show you something that's really, really interesting that I never knew. And I think it's really important that, and you guys can dig this in dig into it for yourself. So, did you hear the story about, and some of you guys already know this, but Abraham God promised him a son. He was 90-something years old. He got impatient, and his wife said, go ahead and have sex with the,
Our ultimate take.
right. Well, there was two sons that it was Isaac and Ishmael. Hold on, I'm spelling this. And let's go all the way forward. If you go all,
I was gonna say, one real quick thing, okay, so just make sure everyone's clear on Abraham versus Abram. You know, I don't want,
Same person.
he first was, his real name was Abram, okay? Once he got into the covenant with God, God changed his name to Abraham.
As well as
Father of
Sarah.
all.
Sarah was
And
Sarai.
Sarah was Sarai, thank you. And then she became Sarah.
Well, when you dig down further and you read this in Genesis, God blessed Isaac, right? He was the one, that was the son that came from the promise. Ishmael was the son that came from that union between him and the slave. Well, fast forward all the way past this and go all the way past the New Testament. Guess who these people are? They're the Arabs.
Muslims.
The Muslims. And then if you take Isaac and you extend him, where's Isaac leading?
To the cross.
He's leading to Jesus. You want to know what's going on in Israel today and segue into the end times and Revelations and all this other stuff? It all starts right here. It's so interesting to know that's where it all ends. And how many people took Pastor Bernie's end times class here? Fascinating. Or who took Revelation class? If he doesn't get it, you gotta go. It's mind blowing once you understand all this stuff. In that, if you understand the story of Ishmael and the Arabs, did you know that they have a whole end time story also, and it replicates, it copies what we know as the end times, and it's called, and their so-called Christ is called the Mahdi. Who the Mahdi is actually our Antichrist. So it's mind blowing, and they believe it.
It's
So
called
what they,
alter ending.
yeah, so what the devil has always tried to do is try to replicate God,
Wrongly.
right? And he replicates everything. Well, this whole line starting in Ishmael ends up in the end times. It's the exact opposite of what Jesus represents in the end times.
Are you kidding me?
Are you kidding me?
He's a puppy dog.
So I just thought that was interesting, but these are the kind of things that you have to go into the Old Testament to read yourself, and you think, oh, it's just a bunch of old books and it doesn't relate. It directly relates exactly what's going on today, and it relates to what's going to happen to each and every one of us in the end times. Hopefully sooner than later. But I digress. On to Exodus.
Well, do we want to go through a little bit of, because Abraham, there's a lot of stuff in Abraham. You know, his son going to the 12 tribes. Just so you have this real quick. You know, of course, Abraham's son was who? Isaac.
Isaac's son was Jacob.
A-A-C. Okay? A-A-C. Okay, so then we went to Isaac, but now his son was who?
Jacob.
No.
Jacob.
Jacob. J-A-C-O-B. Jacob is a story all in itself. What came from Jacob, real quick? What was he renamed by God?
Israel.
Israel. Exactly. That was what he became. God said he would be renamed Israel. Okay, also from Jacob, what do we have? His 12 sons would be representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. All right. Okay? Sorry guys, my handwriting's not the greatest. Okay? Which ultimately, goes into Jesus. Who did he he deceived his older brother out of his inheritance, right? We were talking about.
They were twins.
They were twin. He came out second, holding his ankle. But anyway, with that said, who betrayed him, like in the story? So he ended up with 4 wives. He only wanted the first one, but he had to do a lot. He had to do 14 years of labor to get his wife that he wanted out of his uncle Laban, right? B-I-N, Laban.
Close enough.
Yeah, it's close enough.
Close enough.
Don't take us
Okay.
out, don't.
But now, what's his son? Who's his son?
Laban's son?
No,
Jacob.
Jacob's. I'm saying Jacob is the main focus here on this. This guy really has a lot of stuff comes out of Jacob. Jacob's son
Joseph.
is Joseph. Joseph with the coat of many colors, right? But what I'm doing this for is, okay, where does Joseph go to? Ultimately, because his other brothers sell him into slavery. They don't like him. He goes to Egypt, okay? He goes into Egypt. So, what I'm getting at now, what really is fascinating to me, we know that now we're going to get into Exodus. Well, when you read the whole story, he goes into Egypt. Joseph does. Okay, we're at the end here. Joseph goes into Egypt as a slave. God blesses him. He ends up being the number 2 person under Pharaoh in the whole of Egypt. Well, the Pharaoh starts to have dreams and doesn't understand what they're saying. That was the 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. So Joseph was able to let him know what was going on. They basically, with that knowledge from God, saved the entire area, not just Egypt. Well, that's when his brothers came to Egypt to get food because they had stored all the food because they knew what was going to happen. Well, at that point, that's how most of the Israelis or the Hebrews at that time ended up in Egypt. That's where we start off with. And then they became basically, because they were multiplying and multiplying, the Egyptians started saying, oh, we've got too many of these people here. That's when they made them slaves. That's how the whole story of Exodus and Moses started. That's why the Hebrews were there. It's not that they were conquered. They went there on their own and stayed there for 400 years. Okay, and then slowly became enslaved. Okay?
Now we're in the book of Exodus. So let's watch this. We're going to get the big picture.
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book, Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family and family. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there as a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do too. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries have passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, and they filled the land. Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing that God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as a vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all the world. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here, Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them in forced labor, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Now Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent children has become good to him. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that God will use to defeat Pharaoh's evil. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the point of the story seems to be this. Even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all of these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with the final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the Lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual of Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young, spotless lamb and painted its blood on the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over, and the sons spared. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son. And he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave that Pharaoh changes his mind. And he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the Sea. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people. So after the Israelites sing their song, the story takes a sharp turn. The Israelites are trekking through the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai, and they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they start criticizing Moses and God for even rescuing them. They say they long for the good old days in Egypt. It's crazy. So God graciously provides food and water for Israel in the wilderness, but these stories, they cast a dark shadow. And we begin to wonder, could it be that Israel's heart is just as hard as Pharaoh's? We shall see. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Exodus.
Real quick, what's the movie made? Charleston Heston? Yeah, the Ten Commandments, that's this movie.
Has anybody watched the Ten Commandments from the 50s?
Yeah.
Man, I'm telling you, we watched it, maybe a month or so ago? Rewatched it. Once you understand the story, go back and watch it. Oh, by the way, when you watch the old Ten Commandments, there really was like 20,000 people out there. It wasn't CGI. I mean,
Yeah.
they did the movie right.
Extras,
Yeah, there's no, all the extras and all the stuff into it.
Oh, yeah, like I said, we said, we gotta see that movie, we gotta watch it, 'cause we knew we were gonna try to do this. And I've seen the movie my entire life, and I've seen it on and off, but now that when you know the Bible, and you also, the director, Cecil B. Mills, he comes on and he says, he tries to keep that movie biblically correct, and man, he does. Then when you watch the movie, it takes on a whole different, and it's really well done.
Imagine if Hollywood would do that today.
Again, it'd be a positive. So when you get a chance, hopefully sometime soon, instead of putting some garbage in Hollywood, putting out these days, you can go stream it for free from a lot of different sources. Go watch the Ten Commandments again. It's awesome.
It's a pretty cool movie.
It is cool.
So, anyway, go ahead.
I don't know if I misunderstood. It said that Moses' mother was the Pharaoh's daughter.
No.
No? Did I miss that?
Yes and no. Moses' stepmother, when she took the baby out and then became his mother.
Okay.
But not his biological
I
mother.
misunderstood
Yeah.
that. It looked like the Pharaoh's daughter was hiding him.
She did, because she claimed him as her own, but all of a sudden she has a baby and nobody, I don't know if she was married.
But she didn't
She
have him
obviously
in the
wasn't
reeds.
pregnant.
I mean, she didn't put him in the...
No, she didn't put him in the reeds,
She's the
his
one that
sister
found
did that.
The sister, they were basically, her job was to make sure that an alligator or something didn't eat the basket on the way down.
So she
Follow
watched and
the
took
basket, and make sure the basket was safe.
and then she hid.
Right.
And then she hid and watched who took Moses.
Which
That's how
you see all played out in the Ten Commandments.
Yeah,
It really
that's
ties it
what
all
it is,
together.
yeah.
It's like, what now?
It is a river scene with her in the water and all. Like I said, it's a cool movie. I just watch it for entertainment. Then when I watched it just a month ago, it was like, wow, this is pretty cool. So anyway, but yeah, any other questions while we're doing this up to this point? I know we've gone through a lot of information.
2,000 years.
Yeah, about 2,000 years worth. So any other questions or but yeah, she become like stepmom.
So was he an Israelite then? Why?
He was Israeli, yeah.
He was
He
Hebrew.
Hebrew.
He was Hebrew at that time, what they call Hebrews. But remember the decree went out because Pharaoh got a prophecy that a king would come out of that group and do what Moses is gonna do. He was prophesied to do that. So that's when he said, all 2 years and younger, kill him. Kill them all. And that's when he hid him, put him in the basket and put him in the river.
Okay.
So,
Who's the Pharaoh's son? And what's his name? Because there's that's going on in the Ten Commandments too.
Ramses and.
yeah.
Ramses. Oh, it's hilarious because Moses is messing not only with the Pharaoh's hand, but you've got him and the son going at it.
Yeah, the actual true heir, which is Ramses.
The blood son.
Yeah, the blood
the
son.
blood son, they go at it. Anyway, it's.
Which we're trying to get you to go watch that movie after you've seen this, obviously. Trust me, it's when I tell you something's good, take that to the bank. It's good.
So, okay, as you can tell, once I make such a point, what it is, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Egypt, well, at that point, we've now transferred from Genesis now to Exodus. So now we kind of gave you up to this point, where Pharaoh's finally, after all the plagues. Also, a little keynote here. I didn't bring the book with me, daggone it. The plagues, the 10 plagues. Each one of those had certain things. Frogs, the red, the blood, all these different plagues. Well, the thing is, which I just learned, I thought it was really cool, I said, wow. Each one of those plagues, there was an Egyptian god that controlled them. So in other words, it's basically God saying your Egyptian gods are useless. Here's what I'm going to do. Okay, frog god, here's what I'm going to do. Now control them. I know it sounds silly, but each one of the plagues, the Egyptians had a god for that.
You picking them apart one at
And
a
he was
time.
just starting to pick them all, and then finally death at the end, where he's God on earth, right? That's what they believed. He could keep death from coming across this country. Well, God said, no, we're going to teach you that too. So when the angel of death comes through Egypt, you have no control, you have no power here. We'll show you who's really in control.
The thing you'll start noticing, at least I did, is the cleverness and the complication of God throughout this whole story. He is so much infinitely smarter than all the human beings, and no matter what kind of schemes, he's got the perfect, absolute perfect answer to all of it. And it starts there, and it doesn't end till you close the book in the book of Revelation, all the way through. It's crazy. All right, on to Exodus.
Verses 1 through 18, which tell the foundational story of how God rescued the enslaved Israelites by confronting and defeating Pharaoh, while offering a way of escape through the blood of the Passover lamb. God then delivered his people by bringing them through the waters of the sea and then into the wilderness, where, surprisingly, they grumbled and complained. Now, the second half of the book of Exodus opens as Moses leads Israel to the foot of Mount Sinai, where God invites the nation of Israel to enter into a covenant relationship. And here we reach another key moment in the biblical storyline, because this is picking up and developing God's promise to Abraham. So remember, from the book of Genesis, God promised that through Abraham's family, somehow he would restore his blessing to all of the nations. And here we find out more. God says that if Israel obeys the terms of the covenant, they will be so shaped by God's laws and teaching and justice that they will become a kingdom of priests, which means that they will become God's representatives and show all of the other nations what God is truly like.
Yeah.
Now the people of Israel eagerly accept the offer, and so God's presence appears right on the top of Mount Sinai in the form of cloud and lightning. And Moses goes up as their representative, and God opens with the basic terms of the covenant, the famous 10 Commandments. These are like the basic terms of the agreement, how the Israelites and God are going to relate to each other. And then after this comes another collection of commands which fill out the first 10 in more detail. There are laws about Israel's worship, about social justice, how they are to live together, all shaping Israel into a nation of justice and generosity that's different from the other nations. So Moses writes down all of these laws, and he brings them down to the people who, again, eagerly agree to enter into this covenant with God. And once they do so, God takes the relationship forward another step. He tells Moses that he wants his holy, divine, and good presence to come and dwell right in the midst of Israel, which develops another aspect of God's covenant promises. So remember, after humanity's rebellion in the garden, it was access to God's presence that was lost. But now it's through the family of Abraham that God's presence is becoming once again accessible through this covenant relationship, and first with Israel, and then somehow one day to all nations. So what follows are 7 chapters of detailed architectural blueprints about this sacred tent called the tabernacle. There's an outer courtyard with an altar, and then in the center there's a tent that has an outer room and then an inner room. And then inside the inner room, which is called the most holy space, is a golden box called the Ark of the Covenant. And there's angelic creatures over the top of it. It's the hot spot of God's presence. Now there's lots of detail in these chapters, and it's important to know that every piece has some kind of symbolic value. All of the flowers, the angels, the gold, and the jewels, it all echoes back to the Garden of Eden, the place where God and humans lived together in intimacy. And so the tabernacle is like a portable Eden, so to speak. It's the place where God and Israel can live together in peace, at least in theory, because right here something goes really, really wrong. Israel breaks the covenant. As Moses is up on the mountain receiving the blueprints for the tabernacle, down below at the camp, the Israelites, they're losing patience. And so they ask Moses' brother Aaron to make for them a golden calf idol so they can worship it as the God who saved them out of slavery in Egypt. Now God's presence is right there on top of the mountain. They can see it. But here they are below, breaking the first 2 commands of the covenant they just agreed to. No other gods and no idols. Now what follows is really important. God knows what's happening down below. And so he first invites Moses into his own anger and anger. He tells Moses what he wants to do, just to wipe Israel out. But Moses intercedes by appealing to God's character. He says, first of all, destroying Israel would be going back on your covenant promises. And then Moses appeals to God's reputation among the nations. What would they think if they seek to destroy their own? And so God accepts Moses' intercession, and he relents. And while he does bring his judgment on those who instigated idolatry, he forgives the nation as a whole promises to renew his covenant. And it's right here, at this point in the story, that God, for the first time, describes his own character to Moses. He says, the Lord is merciful, he's gracious, he's slow to anger, abounding in covenant faithfulness. He forgives sin, but he will not leave the wicked unpunished. So we have this tension. God is full of mercy, but also he must deal with evil if he claims to be good. And above all, God is faithful to his promises, even though it means, he knows, he's committing himself to a people who are utterly faithless. And so after renewing the covenant with Israel, God commissions Moses to go ahead and build the tabernacle. And once again, we get 5 long chapters describing in detail the construction of the tabernacle. And it all comes together in the final chapter, where the tabernacle is finished. God's glorious divine presence comes and hovers over the tent, and our hopes are high. And so Moses, he goes right up to enter into the tent, and he can't. He actually can't go in, and that's how the book ends. It's really surprising, but not really if you think about it. You can see now how much Israel's sin has damaged the relationship with God in more ways than we realize. So the book opens, remember, with Pharaoh's evil, threatening Israel and threatening God's covenant promise. But now, as the book ends, Israel has become its own worst enemy. It's their sin that's threatening the future of the covenant. And so the question as the book closes is, how is God going to reconcile this conflict between his holiness and his goodness and his presence with the sinful corruption of his own covenant? The solution to that problem is what the next book is about. But for now, that's the book of Exodus.
All right.
Okay, that's, any questions on that? I love how that just starts off with 1 page and then by the end it's all full and it went over everything. Any questions on this? Yes, sir.
One thing that kind of confuses me, is you see it happen sometimes, is how do you change God's mind? Like,
Right.
there's nothing he didn't think of. Moses didn't tell him anything he didn't already know. So if he was going to do something, how did Moses convince him to do something else?
Yeah, well, I mean, you hear about it a lot. I mean, look how, Abraham, said, look, if you can find 50, you can find 40, you can find 30, And I think God knows he's going, I don't think God's changing his mind. I think God has a plan and it's ultimately come out. He's letting the humans do their thing, but they think they're negotiating. You don't negotiate with God. We all know that.
Right.
That's the only way I can perceive it. To be honest,
Here's one thing I think, and Liz and I were talking about this on the way to church. You have no idea how complicated and how sophisticated God, nobody does, how he is. And is it possible, okay, all these people and all these things that happen throughout time, but ultimately to get us to the end of this linear timeline that we're all living in, is it not possible that he set all this stuff in motion? And let's say Moses goes A or goes B. It doesn't matter what he make that choice because God can redo all the other situations moving on that forward to end up at the same goal. You see what I'm saying? He is so complicated that wouldn't surprise me at all. Because we know that we have that free will that's given to us in this, and everybody has that. They can choose A or B or C. But is not God complicated enough? If even Moses chooses B, he's already done thought about that, and it would change everything down the line for his ultimate purpose.
Or he wanted to give Moses the opportunity to make the case, or
Exactly.
whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
He already planned it.
yeah, he knows.
He already knew what he was going to do, but he wanted Moses to make the argument to him.
To think about it, I guess, or see where Moses' mind was. Was he going to try to plead their case? Yeah, they're a bunch of sinners. They've now created this golden calf down here, but they're in the desert. They followed you, but they're still sinners. They created the calf. Where was Moses' heart? Was he testing that maybe?
I see God showing him all the timeline from the past to the future. His love for us. It's
Mercy and grace.
That overrides everything. And I see when we go to God, like we go to God, John 3:16, for example. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, see all through the timeline. It's God's love.
Yep.
It's love.
Continue. That's why, you know, if you read the Bible or any part of the beginning of the Bible, it talks about the Bible being a love story.
Yeah,
It's exactly what it is. It's a love story. That's what he calls it. So.
And just by only focusing on the New Testament, that's only part of the story.
Yeah.
It starts all out here. We can't obviously go over everything with you, but again, what this is supposed to do is motivate you to pick up the Bible yourself. Now that you're somewhat familiar with it, and go back and read all this stuff. I'm telling you that if you do that, the more there's different levels to this.
It's a mystery.
It's a mystery, but I am convinced the more, it's like anything else in life, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. And I'm going to give you guys some examples. I had one of these today. It keeps happening to me where God's revealing stuff to me, and it's just like, I feel privileged that I know things that most people don't know. And the only reason is because I take the time and effort to read it and look at His Word. And I'll give you a couple examples today. And they lie in what I'm getting ready to talk to you about. There's 3 books in the section of law that we have not talked about. And we're not going to have a chance to talk about because we don't have time. We got another 2,000 years we got to deal with here. But let's talk. I'm going to give you a brief on Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I'm going to show you where I found some things in Numbers, and I talked about one of them last week that just blew my mind. So Leviticus, let me just give you the brief. And I got a little cheat sheet. I got this off of ChristianBooks.com. I got a whole bunch of them. I've got one on these. I've got one on the disciples. I don't know all the disciples stuff. I'm not going to teach you this stuff, so I'm already
We're
studying.
going to get that one passed out.
Yeah, we're probably
We're
gonna
going to get that one for you.
I ordered Feast in the Bible. This has got a lot to do with the Jewish system of festivals, and it links directly to the end times, which is my big thing. What else did I get
But
here?
Numbers is that really boring book, right?
No, it's not.
Well, yeah, I thought it was, but I'm going to show you that it's not. Here's another one that I got, and Sherry actually turned me onto this one. Christianity and cults. It breaks down all these other religions. So when your Mormon guy comes talking smack to you, you can come right to
You know what to say.
yeah, you can just take his legs out immediately. So instead of taking 2 minutes to figure it out. But anyways, so Leviticus. Let me just give you a brief
Can I
overview.
just-
Yes.
God slaps you. Once you get to a point, and you start really looking into His Word, God will slap you upside the head. He's done it to me so many times. And I made a statement one night. We were here in Bible study, and we were talking about if a new Christian would come in, what book would you try to, what books would you want him to read? I said, well, pretty much anything other than Numbers. That was my quote, right? I kid you not, 2 days later, we had a little thing going with the family where one person a week or so would put in a Bible verse. The very first one that comes out of Ohio was Numbers. I'm like, wow, okay. That's what happened Sunday. Pastor did a thing on Numbers without me know, but it was like, okay, I said Numbers I wouldn't recommend.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, Numbers. It just kept hitting me with Numbers. And I was like, wow, is that a coincidence, or was it a guy hitting me upside the head and saying, don't ever say that again. Don't, we want to read everything in the Bible. And now that we're into this Numbers, it is cool.
Yeah, I'm going to show you a couple things that hit me. So we got 3 books remaining: Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Go find your golden nugget, but the only way you're going to find it is reading the Word of God yourself. Read it yourself. Okay, so all 3 of them were written by Moses. Okay, Leviticus, what? Law and sacrifice. Where? The Sinai and Canaan. This happened around 1400 BC. Why? To instruct Israel on how to be holy and be a blessing to others. The key verse in there is, consecrate yourself and be holy, because I am Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. I am the Lord who makes you holy. Right? We get our righteousness how? From where? The blood of Jesus. And that's it. There's nothing you can do on your own for righteousness. Well, it just points that right out in Leviticus. Numbers. This is where, and then he started me with Numbers. I'm like, I can't read that book. And he told me that story. And then I started reading it. I'm like, hold on for a second. What? And I'll show you 2 of them that I found. One before and one today. This morning I found one in Numbers. So Numbers was written by Moses. It's a census in history. Same area, the borders of Canaan, happened around the same time, 1400. Reminder of what happens when people rebel against God. And the key verse, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. So, one of the first things that I found out in this Numbers thing was Numbers 2:22, and I think I talked about it last week a little bit. When you're reading 2:22, and I tried to read this after Dave said this to me, I'm like, this is brutal. So if you get right before that, Balaam goes with messengers, and you get up to is it 22? Where is it? Chapter, I'm in 2:22.
Yeah.
The order of the tribes in their tents, and you get to 22, and his host, and he said they were numbered of them for 30 and 5,400. We've given you he's talking about the camp of Israel. God's instructing, I was reading something, what is he talking about? But then you have the handout on the tabernacle. All of them were numbered in the camp of Ephraim, were in 100,000 and 8,000 and 100 throughout their armies, and they shall go forward in the third rank. The standard of the camp of Dan shall be on the north side by their armies, and the captain of the children of Dan shall be blah, blah, blah. And this host, it goes on, it talks about 100,000 here, 4,000 here, blah, blah, blah. Well, when you lay it all out, if you're looking at it from a mountaintop, this is what it is. Hello, what do we see here? Obviously, it's the crucifixion. So you're telling me, when God, obviously who's up here in the eternity, set forth in motion this whole plan, right? And the Bible and everything, when he set up the camp of Israel, he told them how to put it out. And they couldn't do it at that time. They couldn't look at it like a helicopter looks at it from there. You're telling me that he wanted these 12 tribes, the number here, number there, to do a cross? Is that not pointing towards Jesus and the salvation of our souls? That's amazing. So you take a chapter that is talking about, and it makes no sense to me.
Just a bunch of numbers.
Just a bunch of numbers, but when you lay it all out, you do a little research, you come to find, holy cow, there is something to be gained by reading this. Here's another one I found out this morning. 24:17. It's weird. I watch a lot of sermons and videos, especially on the end times. I'm really into prophecy. You can thank Pastor Bernie for getting me hooked on that. But I heard a thing this morning about the Star of Jacob, 24:17. And if you look in, the guy was talking about the Star of Jacob, and I'm like, what the heck's this guy talking about? It was a end times video, and I looked it up, and then 24 numbers. It says, I shall see. He's talking about the Star of. Remember, there was a Star of Bethlehem when Christ first appeared. This guy is saying before the rapture, I don't know if it's true or not, there'll be another appearance. He postulates that before the rapture, the Star of Jacob, he thinks is going to be a supernova that actually exploded 2,000 years ago, but it's so far away from humanity, the light has taken 2,000 years to travel. It's a prophecy that when we see that supernova, that is the last sign before the revelations. I don't know if it's true or not, but I went and read this, and at 24:17 it says, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and the scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. Wow. Is that really the sign of the second coming of Christ and the rapture? I don't know. But it's interesting, this guy's talking about it.
A lot of parallels.
A lot of parallels. So one of the reasons I really got into all this stuff, especially the Old Testament, because I learned in the New Testament in Revelation about the coming end times, which Jesus talked about and the disciples basically documented. We know it's true. It's coming. It was all foreshadowed in the Old Testament. Then I said, I got to go back and read the Old Testament. All this prophecy is sprinkled throughout all this stuff, and it's all interconnected. How is this possible that 40 people over 1,500 years and all these things that happen all are one combined integrated message? It's very obvious how it happened. It's God's word. It's just that simple. So, I just thought those two were very interesting. And then the last book, where is my Bible book, is Deuteronomy, Moses, sermons by Moses, that same time, 1400. Why? To remind people of what God expects of them. So, a lot of rules in there. The key verse, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. What is that known as? Bingo. It is our biggest commandment, is it not? To love with all your heart, everything you got.
Real quick, 400 years, you want to explain that real quick?
Oh, yeah. I've been trying to figure out, there's a, you know, at the end of the Old Testament, before the New Testament, there's
That's
this
before Jesus.
Before Jesus, right over here, there's this 400-year period of silence. And me and Dave have been talking about this, and I said, how am I going to explain this to people? I don't even understand what it is. Is it prophesized in the Old Testament? Does anybody talk about this, what this 400-year, because God talked to nobody, right? Between Malachi and John the Baptist, am I correct?
Yeah.
So 400-year, why? What is the reason? And we can't, the only explanation, and Pastor Bernie gave it to me, was that the coming of Jesus, his birth, was such a momentous occasion, which it is. That's why there's this big, that really doesn't answer it for me. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I'm searching. I want to try to get this figured out.
I've heard everything from the guy just said, whoa, I got to take a breath, you know, before I send Jesus. Or but anyway, we don't know.
But
it's
today,
a 400-year period of just silence before the New Testament and Jesus takes off. Okay, the new covenant.
but that it came up today.
Come up today with 400 years. 400 years is between when did he take a breath here? When okay, you guys, Joseph, everyone, and now the Hebrews have gone into Egypt. Okay, that's what we're gonna do. Then at this point, we're really gonna start again. Is this the same kind of pause that we had at the end of the Old Testament to when Jesus appeared? I'm not saying that. That's a question.
Has anybody heard of a reason for that, or know why there was that 400-year period of silence?
I had a question, not an answer. I was going to say, how many covenants are there? So there's Abraham, then there was Moses with the 10 Commandments and the law, and then there's the new covenant.
Yeah, they talk about that. Remember they were saying that, you know, God in his, he makes, even though he knows that humans are fallible, there's no way they're going to hold their end of the bargain.
Yeah.
He continually makes these deals or these covenants with them. Now, when we talk about the Old Testament, we talk about all these different ones. As the Old Testament,
Several.
yeah.
500.
Well, there's always 7 in the Bible, and whenever you say that, I always just say the number 7.
But what we're getting at is, you know, we consider all these back here as the Old Testament. All those are a moot point once we get into Jesus. The Jesus is the new one. It's done. We don't sacrifice animals anymore. Nothing of that. Jesus sacrificed himself to save you.
So,
And that,
The Old Testament is covered in taken away.
yes, yes.
so
Exactly.
it's funny here, it's talking about 7. 7 covenants. We need to follow that up with Pastor Bernie. But that would line up with what 7 that I want to talk about? My big thing is dispensations. You're going to hear about that.
We all know, you
Completion. Everything's 7 in the Bible.
number
3, 7, 8, completion 12.
12.
Yep.
Okay, so that pretty much, is there anything else?
Other than the closing prayer and
Yeah.
answering of any questions.
Any questions? Because we're running short, we don't want to get you too late getting downstairs. Any questions? I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Are you guys starting to connect some of the dots? Yeah?
Hope it's starting to become a little bit more clear. I mean, it's amazing to me. I mean, it just, every time, on our Monday Bible studies, read things and I'm like, wow, I didn't know that. And it's just new tidbits. In the Bible, it says if you put in the will to want or desire, he'll let you see it. And boy, is it true. It is so true.
Before closing prayer and then talk, because actually.
Okay, good?
Sure.
Okay.
Dear Father in heaven, thank you very much for being here with us today and helping your instructors teach your word and for our students here to understand the word. It's so important to us that not only that we can understand what you're trying to tell us human beings, but that we're able to put it into practice in our lives. So God, continue to please bless us all and help us learn more about you and eventually leading to that ultimate promise that you have given us, our inheritance, which is to be with you in eternity for all times. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. Was the tables a little better this week than just sitting in the chair? Yeah.
Does anybody want any coffee before I pour it out?
No, I do. Yeah, you don't want a pencil put on the table and I'll bring that for next week.
Oh. So I remember when you
I know, I saw him watch shooting. Yeah, so it's good. Yeah, but you don't shoot that too often.
No, I didn't buy much. I couldn't afford to buy shit.
What did he buy? How much did he buy?
I bought all. I paid for the 30 car game.
How many did you shoot? 50 rounds through?
It's very satisfying. It's like pitching around. It's a shot.
Oh, it's a snap.
Yeah, so
Well, that's what it was known for. It's right on the money. You're doing this. I'm sorry, you do it. That gun was set down properly, and it would hit 400 yards. You could get like that type of, grouping. So,
it's very good. It's very
oh yeah, it's a snap. Huh?
very light.
It's on the floor, yeah.
It's heavy, but yeah. Light from the ones out there, that time.
Right in the 1903.
Yeah, he starts out like a 15.
Right in the 1903.
Yesterday.
He did. No, I had to.
It reminds me of something in the Bible. Because every form of the book sings.
Yeah.
Because
Because I'm leaving the stack with Republican up here if you want some more, get it. I'm just gonna get the
And
stack on my way out.
because they believe in everybody.
I don't think that coffee pot is working.
I know, it's not saying on, is it?
No.
God
Is the
always
burner on?
said that in the city.
Yeah.
Obviously, the light for the burner.
To take, to set.
You gotta keep the hot plate on.
And they talk about cleaning my in the boat, in the art.
Yeah,
Was that when he
But he
walked
went-
to them, or was that when he was
Where? He
sleeping?
went out high, no, that's Peter. Oh, no, that's not Jonah. But that's Peter.
No, I was thinking, which one was when,
I think Peter went to, it's supposed to go to, Italy or something like that, and the boat went somewhere else, I think. And after the snake beating him, and everybody thought that he was, People die, it's swelling and dying, but never dies.
Yeah. That was after.
Yeah, I still.
After, crucifixion. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's always like, what was this,
I gotta go downstairs.
His was a sleep, not Jonah, but his was a sleeping
So I'll
bag,
take care of that.
and they start panicking.
Panic. Oh, yeah,
And
yes,
And he
yes.
wakes up, he's like, why are you so worried? He's calm down.
They got that, it was 200 in the water to say, everybody was saying. I like your shirt. It's beautiful.
She supplies record table.
So we move on.
It's not, it's,
All right, I gotta go downstairs. I'll see you guys there.
I was.
I just wanted you one. Yeah.
Right, you're like on the edge.
That's exciting.
Where's your coffee?
You'll have back. Yep. I love you guys. I'm gonna get downstairs. Come with me. Mom, I'm gonna come with you. What? Hold on. I'm coming. We have to get a cup and get this down. You need a drink of water? Lexi, is that your water? Nope, I don't have a water.
I think it's mine.
Is that a white cup, Lexi? Some water.
Oh my gosh. I'm gonna send these chickens that attacked by the wolves.
Get the white cup over there. Let's go.
You get like a preview.
Whether I live or die, it's for the Lord. I say when someone dies in their belief, he's another warrior for the Lord.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's no rhyme or reason, it's just God's grace and mercy.
It's awesome. It's totally, yeah, when you said that in front of church, I said, I gotta talk to him about this. I'm like, sometimes it's personal, people don't like talking about stuff like that.
I have to, that's my testimony.
Right.
I
I tell other people.
That's why I write the books and I gives me stuff to where I look at the word. I don't want to take it out of context, but I want it to stay in context, but I want it to be applicable to life, what I'm doing, what I'm seeing and stuff.
So that's what we're trying to hopefully do for this.
No,
one,
this is, this
is
is.
to get people inspired, because unless you have something like you where you're pushed to the limits and God comes to you or whatever, that's separate. But reading the Bible and reading His Word is your doorway.
Yeah,
To
it
closer-
all, God's, you're right, God's word's always the doorway. And you know, I'm gonna tell you something, I can't say it enough. But when you actually die, you don't wanna come back to this world, because there's nothing good about it.
Yeah, it sucks.
You don't,
Yeah.
but for some reason we do.
I want to come back during the millennium. I don't want to come back in the present stuff. I can tell you that right
There
now.
we go.
Cool. Well, thank you.
God bless
That's
you.
good. God bless you.
Thank y'all for taking the time to do it.
You're welcome, we're glad to do it. Have a good time. Thank for
Let's go.
Oh, I will. Okay.
Because they really go quick.
Take these?
Yeah, I make this.
I'm gonna take the David Smith and then
I already have one of those, so this is my second one.
It's never enough, you know, never enough to learn about God. We love it.
Well, very good, thank you.
He has to come back.
I have to relearn
It was like, I was telling these guys, there's different levels to this. I mean, you want to just be casual, you know, not read this thing, you're gonna be right here, but if you want, there's no limit to what you can understand.
How do you do it?
I believe in the Bible, it made me down, made me cry, made me laugh, made me angry,
Oh,
upset.
have close it.
Everything.
It's everything.
Yes.
Oh, look, see, this is the lie. You push it over. What do you think? Are you enjoying it, or is it,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you're,
Yes, and I like the fact that it's moving right along, you know, it's not getting stuck.
We had 2,000 years in a clip.
yeah, we just did 2,000 years, well, no, with this, yeah, we just almost went 4,000.
I wish we could get it, I think this thing's the one. I wish we could get a comparison of how Bernie does it compared to us and how people perceive it.
Yeah.